The first sign that something was wrong inside Hitler's Reich didn't appear on a battlefield. It appeared inside a smoke-filled command tent on the outskirts of Warsaw, where two German officers stood over a frozen map that neither of them completely trusted. A Wehrmacht major rubbed his hands together for warmth. "They're late again," he said quietly. Across the table, an SS officer didn't bother to look up. "We don't adjust to their schedule, they adjust to ours." "You say that every time," the major replied, "and every time my men pay the price." The SS officer tapped the map with his fingertip. "Your men hesitate, ours don't." The major stared at him for a long second. "There's a difference between discipline and suicide." Before the SS officer could answer, the tent flap opened and another Wehrmacht officer stepped in, shaking snow from his coat. "Report from the eastern ridge. The Soviets repositioned overnight. If we move before dawn, we may catch them exposed." The SS officer smiled slightly. "Then we move now." "We're not ready," the major said. "You're never ready," the SS officer shot back. The new arrival shifted uncomfortably. "Headquarters says coordination with the SS battalion is mandatory. Direct order from Berlin." The major sighed. "Berlin gives orders. We're the ones who bury the bodies." The SS officer leaned forward. "If your army had the backbone for this war, maybe there would be fewer bodies." For a moment, silence filled the tent. Outside, distant artillery rolled across the snow like thunder. The major finally spoke again, but his voice was lower. "We're soldiers. You're politicians with rifles." "And you're fossils," the SS officer replied, "dragging old traditions into a new world." The major's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "You think loyalty means shouting slogans. We think loyalty means discipline. That difference is why this war will destroy us from the inside before the enemy ever gets the chance." A runner suddenly burst through the entrance, saluting clumsily. "Message from headquarters. SS units will take operational lead for today's assault." The major closed his eyes for a moment. "Of course they will." The SS officer folded his arms. Finally, someone understands efficiency. The major turned toward him. "Efficiency? You call it that. I call it throwing men into a fire just to impress Himmler. They follow orders, without question. That's not loyalty, that's blindness." Outside the tent, the wind pushed against the canvas like a restless hand. Inside, the officers stood in a silence thicker than the winter air. And before the day was over, this quiet argument would grow into something far larger, something that neither man realized was already tearing the Reich apart. Dawn broke slowly over the frozen tree line, turning the battlefield into a pale gray sheet. The Wehrmacht column stood ready but silent. Engines idled. Breath steamed in the cold. The only movement came from an SS detachment marching confidently to the front, their boots striking in perfect rhythm. Major Hartmann watched them approach. "There they are," he muttered, "right on time when it's their show." An SS officer named Richter stopped beside him. "You sound disappointed, Major." "I sound realistic," Hartmann replied. Richter adjusted his gloves. "Then, realistically, you should prepare your men. My orders are to advance immediately." Hartmann gestured at the ridge. "The Soviets repositioned during the night. We need reconnaissance before—" Richter cut him off. "Your reconnaissance is too slow. My unit will lead. You will follow." A thin smile touched Hartmann's lips. "If you get yourselves killed in the first 5 minutes, who do we follow then?" Richter stepped closer. "You still believe this is your army's war. It isn't. It stopped being that years ago." Before Hartmann could respond, Colonel Brauer, one of the few Wehrmacht officers still respected by both sides, approached. Snow crunched under his boots. "Gentlemen," Brower said, "Berlin wants coordination, not competition." "Berlin," Hartmann said under his breath, "wants miracles." Brower pretended not to hear that. "I've reviewed both plans. The SS proposal is aggressive, but not impossible. The Wehrmacht adjustments are sensible. Combine them." Richter stiffened. "Colonel, with respect, my orders came directly from Himmler's office. They are not suggestions." Brower held his gaze. "Nor are mine." The tension between them thickened. A distant shell exploded, shaking the snow from nearby branches. Hartmann watched Richter's expression harden. Richter spoke first. "Colonel, your army hesitates at every turn. You cling to outdated discipline. This war requires conviction." Hartmann stepped forward. "Conviction without judgment destroys everything." Richter turned to him. "Judgment is not your job. Obedience is." "And who decides what obedience means? Himmler, a man who never saw a real battlefield?" Richter's jaw tightened. "He understands purpose." "He understands power," Hartmann corrected. Brower raised a hand before the argument could spiral. "Enough. We move in 30 minutes. Wehrmacht scouts will go ahead. SS units will flank left. We strike together. No exceptions." Richter looked away, visibly dissatisfied. "I will comply because I must, not because I agree." Brower nodded calmly. "That is the nature of war." Richter walked off without another word. Hartmann exhaled with relief, but Brower's expression stayed troubled. Hartmann asked quietly, "Sir, how long can we keep pretending we're on the same side?" Brower didn't answer at first. His eyes followed the SS troops assembling in perfect formation. Finally, he said, "Until someone in Berlin decides they no longer need us both." Hartmann glanced at the sky, turning pale over the trees. "And when that day comes?" Brower began walking away. "Pray it doesn't come while you're still alive to see it." The engines rumbled louder. The men moved into position. And beneath the calm surface of military order, a hidden civil war continued to grow, quiet, bitter, and deadly.
The assault began under a thin curtain of fog. Wehrmacht scouts moved first, slipping between burned-out farmhouses and shattered tree lines. Behind them, SS units advanced with a rigid precision that ignored every warning the terrain offered. Major Hartmann watched the movement unfold through his field glasses. "They're pushing too far left," he said. Lieutenant Weiss adjusted his helmet. "Maybe they think speed will carry the day." "Speed without awareness gets you surrounded," Hartmann replied. A sudden burst of machine gun fire cracked across the ridge. Hartmann stiffened. The SS column had walked straight into a concealed Soviet position. Weiss muttered, "They didn't even check the flank." Hartmann lowered the glasses. Of course they didn't. Seconds later, a radio operator ran up the trench line. "Message from SS Command," he said breathlessly. "They want immediate reinforcement." Hartmann frowned. "Of course they do." Richter's voice suddenly broke through the static of the field radio. "Major Hartmann, do you copy? We're under heavy fire. Advance now and support our line." Hartmann picked up the receiver. "Your advance was premature. You should have waited for scouting reports." Richter snapped back. "This is not the time for lectures. Move your men, now." Brewer appeared beside them, having overheard the exchange. "Major, prepare the second company. We need to stabilize that flank." Hartmann nodded, but kept his voice low. "Sir, if we rush in blind, we'll take the same losses they're taking." Brewer glanced toward the misty ridge. The gunfire grew sharper, louder. "I know, but we can't let them collapse. The Soviets will break through." Hartmann clenched his jaw. "Very well." He turned to Weiss. "Assemble the men, keep spacing tight and heads low." As Weiss moved away, Brewer spoke quietly. "This is exactly what Berlin refuses to see. Two armies fighting two different wars." Hartmann strapped his helmet, one driven by ideology, the other by survival. Brewer gave a small nod, and both paying the price. The Wehrmacht line pushed forward through thick mud and frozen grass. As they approached the ridge, the scene became painfully clear. SS soldiers pinned behind splintered logs, shouting orders that contradicted one another. Richter spotted Hartman immediately. "You took your time," he said over the noise. Hartman crouched behind cover. "Next time, wait for reconnaissance." Richter shook his head. "Next time, act faster." Hartman gestured toward the Soviet bunkers dug deep across the slope. "You didn't even notice that trench line." Richter brushed dirt from his sleeve. "Our orders were to push forward, and mine were to keep my men alive." A sudden burst of mortar shell landed behind them, sending a shock wave through the ground. Both men froze for a second before continuing. Richter spoke again, quieter this time. "Major, whether you like it or not, our futures are tied to how this war ends." Hartman kept his eyes on the ridge. "No, Captain, our futures are tied to how this war destroys us." Another explosion shook the earth. Dirt rained down. The ridge was turning into a furnace of smoke and snow. Somewhere beneath the chaos, distrust continued to grow, sharper than the bullets flying overhead.
The fighting along the ridge slowed by mid-afternoon. Smoke drifted upward in pale columns. The Soviets had withdrawn to higher ground, leaving behind silence broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant rumble of artillery. Major Hartman stood beside a makeshift field post, watching stretcher teams carry men back toward the forest. Lieutenant Weiss approached, wiping mud from his gloves. "That could have gone much worse," Weiss said. "It went worse than it needed to," Hartman replied, "and you know why." Before Weiss could answer, Richter appeared, his uniform torn and his expression sharp. "Major Hartman, a word." Hartman didn't move. "You can say it here." Richter stepped closer. "Your unit delayed the counterattack." "We waited for information you ignored," Hartman said calmly. "You undermined operational momentum. We prevented a disaster." Richter's eyes narrowed. "Is that how you justify refusing orders?" Weiss stiffened. "No one refused anything. We followed Colonel Breuer's instructions." Richter ignored him. "Major, I will be filing a report with Berlin. Your hesitation cost us ground." Hartman's voice stayed even. "And your rush cost men. We can compare losses if you want." Richter leaned in slightly. "This is not about casualties. This is about loyalty." Weiss took a step forward. "Careful with that word." Richter glanced at him, then returned his attention to Hartman. "Some in Berlin are beginning to question the commitment of certain army officers." Hartman held his stare. "If Berlin wants results, they should question your planning, not our discipline." Before Richter could answer, Colonel Breuer arrived, walking with the controlled impatience of someone who had been listening from a distance. "That's enough," Breuer said. Richter straightened. "Colonel, I need to address a matter of insubordination." Breuer crossed his arms. "Then start with your own. You advanced without verifying the flank." Richter frowned. "Our orders from Himmler's office were explicit, and mine were from the high command. Out here, conflicting orders get people killed. You were told to coordinate." Richter's jaw tightened. "So the army wants to blame us for what happened?" Breuer shook his head once. "No, I want you to understand that authority on this front is not a competition." Richter replied quietly, "Competition is how the Reich works, Colonel." Breuer looked at him for a long moment. "And that is exactly why we are losing." Richter said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, stiff and silent. Weiss exhaled. "Sir, he's going to escalate this." Breuer nodded. "Yes, and Berlin will listen because the Reich feeds on suspicion." Hartman studied the ridge. "So what happens when they run out of enemies outside the Reich?" Breuer answered without emotion.
They look inward. The cold wind pushed across the field, carrying the smoke and the unspoken truth. The war between Germany's enemies had paused, but the war inside Germany had only begun to take shape.
The evening sky turned a dull iron color as the front quieted. Lanterns flickered inside the command post, where Major Hartmann and Lieutenant Weiss reviewed the situation map. The room smelled of damp wool and melting snow. Outside, boots crunched steadily, units returning from the ridge. A courier entered, saluted, and handed Colonel Brower a sealed envelope. Brower broke the wax carefully, scanned the contents, and sighed through his nose. Hartmann asked, "Orders from headquarters?" "Not orders," Brower replied, "questions." Weiss frowned. "About what?" Brower read aloud, "Assessment of unit cohesion, evaluation of officer loyalty, clarification of disagreements with SS command." Hartmann exchanged a glance with Weiss. "That didn't take long." Brower folded the paper. "Berlin wants harmony, but they listen to whoever shouts the loudest. And right now, the SS has a louder voice." Before anyone could respond, the tent flap opened and Captain Richter stepped inside, accompanied by an SS adjutant carrying a notebook. Brower raised an eyebrow. "Captain, you're far from your sector." Richter answered with a tone that tried to sound formal but carried something sharper. "Colonel, I have been instructed to collect statements regarding today's engagement." Hartmann crossed his arms. "Statements or accusations?" Richter ignored him and opened his folder. "Berlin requires clarity. They want to know why the advance was delayed." Brower replied, "Because the enemy repositioned, because a premature assault would have been suicide, because recon exists for a reason." Richter's expression didn't shift. "I need the Major's account." Hartmann stepped forward. "My account? Here it is. We prevented a collapse, saved your flank, and held the line." The SS adjutant scribbled something. Richter looked at him. "Include the delay." Hartmann kept his tone steady. "Include the part where your unit walked into a trench line without checking terrain." The adjutant hesitated. Richter said sharply, "Write it as instructed." Brower spoke again, voice cold but controlled. "Captain, this is not an inquiry. It is an attempt to shift responsibility." Richter turned toward him. "Himmler's office wants accuracy." Hartmann replied, "Himmler's office wants obedience." Richter's voice went low. "And Berlin wants to know which officers still possess it." The tension thickened until finally Weiss intervened. "Captain, with respect, we all serve the same Reich." Richter glanced at him briefly. "Some serve reluctantly." Brower stepped closer to Richter. "You may report whatever you wish, but remember this, we are here to win battles, not arguments in Berlin." Richter closed his folder. "Battles are won by loyalty." Hartmann answered quietly, "Battles are lost by arrogance." Richter stared at him for a long moment before turning toward the exit. "I'll send this report tonight." The SS adjutant followed him into the cold. Brower watched them disappear into the dark. This is how it begins, not with gunfire, with notes, reports, and whispers. Hartmann folded his arms, and soon command will be deciding who they trust more, the army or the party. Weiss muttered, "And when they choose, we'll all feel it." Outside, the night settled heavy over the camp. Somewhere far from the front, in the offices of Berlin, men who never saw the battlefield were already forming judgments that would decide which side of Germany's hidden war would rise next. Snow fell through the night, muffling the front into a dull silence. By morning, a new presence moved through the camp. Unfamiliar faces in crisp black coats, their boots leaving straight lines in the fresh powder. Hartmann noticed them first. "Those aren't field officers," he murmured.
Weiss squinted at the newcomers. Intelligence branch? Worse, Hartman replied. Political intelligence. One of the men approached Colonel Breuer's tent. His uniform bore the insignia of the Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, the office that handled internal surveillance, loyalty checks, and the quiet removals no one talked about. A few minutes later, Breuer summoned both Hartman and Weiss. Inside, the colonel stood beside a small metal stove, arms crossed tightly. A tall SS officer with wire-rimmed glasses waited beside him, hands clasped behind his back. Breuer's tone was clipped. Major, Lieutenant, this is Sturmbannführer Adler. He has been sent by Berlin. Adler nodded politely. I am here to ensure coordination between the Wehrmacht and the SS. Hartman replied evenly. We already coordinate, Sturmbannführer. Adler smiled thinly. Berlin would like to verify that. Weiss shifted his weight. Verify or supervise? Adler turned his head toward him. Both, Lieutenant. Breuer handed Adler a folder. You'll find our operational reports in here. They speak for themselves. Adler opened it briefly, scanning the first page. Captain Richter submitted his account of yesterday's delays. Hartman spoke calmly. Did he also submit the part where his unit advanced without reconnaissance? Adler closed the folder. I will examine all perspectives. My job is not to take sides. Hartman held his gaze. Your job is to decide which side Berlin trusts. Adler didn't deny it. Loyalty is always evaluated, especially in difficult phases of the war. Weiss said, Loyalty to what? The army or the party? Adler replied, Ideally, both. But when conflicts arise, Berlin expects clarity. The room went quiet. Breuer eventually broke the silence. Sturmbannführer Adler will be observing operations for the next several days. He will speak with officers from both branches. Adler nodded. I appreciate your cooperation. Hartman asked, and if we don't cooperate? Adler didn't blink. Then Berlin will assume you have something to hide. Breuer stepped in quickly. That won't be necessary. Everyone here will answer your questions. Adler nodded again. Good. I prefer transparency. When he left the tent, Weiss exhaled slowly. This is a loyalty check. Breuer rubbed his eyes. Of course it is. Hartman stared at the snow gathering on the tent's edge. So it begins. Formal observation, quiet notes, profiles, and eventually decisions. Breuer lowered his voice. Adler isn't here to observe the front. He's here to observe us. Weiss asked, Then what do we do? Hartman answered softly, We do our jobs, but we watch the watchers. Outside, Adler moved calmly between units, taking names, asking quiet questions. No shouting, no threats, just a cold, meticulous gathering of information. And every officer he spoke to understood what it meant. The Reich was no longer looking outward. It was beginning to look inward.
Adler moved through the camp with quiet precision, speaking to officers one by one. Nothing about his tone was hostile, but every question felt like it had two meanings. By noon, rumors were spreading faster than the cold wind. Weiss found Hartman near a cluster of fuel drums. He's been talking to everyone, Weiss said. Cook staff, radio operators, even the drivers. Hartman nodded slowly. He's mapping loyalties. Weiss leaned closer. And the SS officers? They're whispering. Captain Richter keeps telling people the army failed them on the ridge. Hartman wasn't surprised. If they repeat something often enough, Berlin will believe it. Before Weiss could reply, Adler approached, hands clasped behind his back. Major Hartman, a few minutes if you have them. Hartman gestured toward a quiet spot beside the supply crates. Of course. Adler opened his notebook. I want to understand yesterday's events from your perspective. Hartman kept his tone steady. We advanced when it was tactically sound. Had we moved sooner, the losses would have doubled. Adler nodded slowly. Captain Richter claims your hesitation disrupted coordination. Coordination, Hartman said, requires both sides to think, not just charge. Adler didn't react. Do you believe the SS officers acted recklessly? Hartman answered plainly. I believe they acted politically. They wanted a victory they could report to Himmler. Adler paused, then wrote something down. And you believe Berlin should be informed of this? I believe Berlin should know the truth, Hartman replied. Adler met his eyes. Berlin prefers unity over truth. Hartman didn't look away. Unity built on distortion won't last. Adler closed the notebook. Major, politics are part of war. You know that. Hartman answered. They are also the reason wars are lost. Adler studied him for another moment before stepping back. Thank you. That will be all. As soon as Adler walked away, Weiss whispered, He's not neutral. He's measuring how far you'll speak. Hartman didn't deny it. Then we give him reason to doubt the whispers. But the next moment shattered the fragile balance. Shouting erupted near the northern outpost. Hartman and Weiss rushed toward it. When they arrived, they found an SS sergeant standing over a Wehrmacht corporal who sat on the ground clutching his face. Richter stepped forward immediately. Major, control your men. He refused an order from SS patrol. The corporal's voice shook. They told me to abandon the checkpoint and fall in with their squad. I said I needed authorization from my officer. Richter snapped. Defiance in wartime is punishable. Hartman rose slowly. Defiance. He followed protocol. You ignored it. Weiss added, No patrol can reassign a soldier from another branch. Richter's expression hardened. We have full authority to act when army discipline falters. Hartman stepped toward him. You don't have authority to hit my men. Adler arrived just then, drawn by the noise. His eyes moved between the SS sergeant, the injured corporal, and the officers facing off. He spoke quietly, but his words cut through the air. Is this what coordination looks like? Richter straightened. This is what insubordination looks like. Hartman replied, This is what overreach looks like. Adler studied both officers. I will be reporting this incident to Berlin immediately. The camp fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. A line had been crossed, and Berlin no longer saw this as a minor disagreement. The hidden war inside the Reich had reached a point where someone, Army or SS, would soon be judged.
The following morning brought a message stamped with the eagle and swastika seal of the High Command. Colonel Brower read it twice before calling Hartman and Weiss into his tent. His face gave nothing away, but his hands stayed folded tightly behind his back. Hartman asked quietly, Bad news? Brower handed him the paper. Berlin received Adler's report. Weiss read over Hartman's shoulder. The message was short, cold, and unmistakable. Interbranch friction unacceptable. Authority of SS units to be respected without delay. Further disruptions will be treated as direct disobedience to the Reich. Weiss muttered, So they chose a side. Brower shook his head slowly. No, they chose silence, and silence favors the SS. Before they could say more, the tent flap opened. Captain Richter entered without waiting for permission, followed by Adler. The contrast between them was striking. Richter tense and rigid, Adler calm and unreadable. Brower gestured toward the papers on the table. You've seen the message. Richter answered first. Berlin has made its expectations clear. I trust there won't be any further complications. Hartman met his eyes. Complications happen when orders conflict. Richter stepped closer. Then perhaps the real problem is adherence. Weiss bristled. We adhere to military law, not personal ambition. Richter ignored him and turned to Brower. Colonel, the SS will assume greater responsibility in tomorrow's push. Army units will support where instructed. Brower raised an eyebrow. Supporting is one thing, relinquishing command is another. Richter replied, Berlin expects compliance. Hartmann said quietly, Berlin expects victory. You want obedience. Richter's jaw tightened. You're walking a thin line, Major. Adler finally spoke. Enough. We're not here to escalate tensions. Richter looked at him, surprised. Adler continued, The High Command wants stability, not another internal dispute. Brower asked, What exactly qualifies as a dispute nowadays? Adler closed the folder in his hands. Anything that disrupts unity. Hartmann replied, Unity built on fear isn't unity. Adler's eyes shifted to him. Careful, Major. Words travel farther than you think. Something in his tone made Weiss step forward. Is that a warning? No, Adler said calmly. It's an observation. Richter spoke again. For the sake of the Reich, we need a structure free from hesitation. Some officers, he paused, letting the silence weigh heavily, may not be suited for their positions. Hartmann didn't look away. You mean officers who think before acting. Richter said, Officers he may be replaced. The tent went still. Brower broke the silence. Replaced by whose authority? Richter didn't answer. Adler did. Himmler's office has begun reviewing field leadership. They want recommendations. Hartmann asked, Recommendations from whom? Adler replied, From those who demonstrate initiative. Richter's expression made the message clear. He was already preparing a list, and Hartmann suspected exactly whose names would appear on it. Outside, snow continued falling in soft, relentless sheets, quiet, steady, and indifferent. Inside the tent, the real winter had only just begun.
The next day dawned with an unusual stillness. No briefings, no shared planning, no joint patrols. Hartmann noticed something was wrong as soon as he stepped outside his tent. SS troops were already assembled in full gear, moving with purpose toward the eastern tree line. Weiss jogged up beside him. They're forming up for something. Hartmann frowned. We didn't authorize any operation. A Wehrmacht runner arrived, breathless. Major, Colonel Breuer wants you immediately. Inside the command post, Breuer stood over the map table, jaw tight. Adler and Richter were already present, their expressions unreadable. Breuer pointed to the map. An SS assault group is moving toward Hill 43. No coordination, no notification. Hartmann leaned over the table. Hill 43? That position is fortified. They'll be wiped out. Richter replied calmly. They have orders from Berlin. Hartmann looked at him sharply. Berlin ordered an assault without consulting field command? Richter didn't blink. Berlin trusts initiative. Weiss said, This isn't initiative, it's recklessness. Adler stepped in. The operation is meant to demonstrate independence of action. Himmler's office approved it. Breuer stared at him. Independence of action or independence from command? Adler didn't answer. Hartmann spoke quietly. They're walking into a trap. Richter finally showed a hint of emotion. Then the army should support them. Hartmann replied, With what plan? We weren't briefed. Richter said, Then adapt. Weiss stepped forward. Adapt? To an operation we knew nothing about? That's how units get encircled. Adler interjected calmly. Gentlemen, this is an opportunity. If the assault succeeds, morale improves. If it fails, Berlin will reassess command structures. Hartmann stared at Adler. Reassess or replace? Adler gave a small, thin smile. Results dictate decisions. Breuer's tone dropped to a controlled, heavy register. How many men are they sending? Richter answered, 2 companies.
Hartmann's eyes widened. 2 against that ridge? They won't last an hour. Weiss turned to Breuer. Sir, we can't just watch this happen. Breuer looked torn, the weight of command pulling him in opposite directions. If we intervene without authorization, Berlin will accuse us of undermining SS operations. Hartmann said, if we don't, we'll be pulling bodies out of the snow all night. Adler folded his hands. Colonel, the High Command expects order. That means respecting boundaries. Breuer stared at the map. Boundaries that kill our own men? Richter said quietly, some sacrifices are necessary. Hartmann stepped toward him. Not sacrifices made for political theater. Richter didn't respond. Breuer finally spoke, voice firm but low. Major Hartmann, Lieutenant Weiss, assemble a relief detachment, not a full deployment, a rescue group only. Adler's eyes narrowed. Colonel, that is not authorized. Breuer replied, neither was this assault. Richter started to protest, but Breuer cut him off. I will answer for the consequences. Hartmann nodded. We'll move out immediately. Breuer placed a hand on the map, his fingers trembling slightly. Bring back who you can. Hartmann turned to leave. Weiss followed. Behind them, Adler and Richter exchanged a glance, one cold, one calculating. The SS assault had begun. The rescue would begin moments later, and Berlin would judge them all by the outcome. Snow whipped across the ridge as Hartmann's rescue detachment advanced in staggered formation. Smoke rose from Hill 43 in dark spirals. Gunfire echoed faintly, then sharply, then faded again. Weiss pressed his hand against his helmet. Major, that's close-range fire. They're surrounded. Hartmann scanned the slope. The SS assault group had been pinned inside a shallow ravine, their positions exposed. Dozens of figures crouched behind shattered tree stumps, firing blindly uphill. Hartmann signaled to his men. Move fast, cover each other, stay low. As they approached, an SS sergeant stumbled toward them, face pale, uniform torn. Where is your commanding officer? Hartmann asked. The sergeant pointed weakly toward the ravine. Dead or wounded, I don't know. We walked right into them. Weiss exchanged a grim look with Hartmann. Just like we warned. Hartmann crouched beside the sergeant. Listen carefully. We're getting you out, but you follow our signals, not your own. The sergeant nodded shakily. Moments later, they crawled into the ravine where the surviving SS men huddled in a mix of determination and panic. One recognized Hartmann immediately. You came, he said breathlessly. Hartmann nodded. Let's move. Stay behind my line. Bullets snapped through branches as the group began pulling the wounded back. A young SS private whispered, Why are you helping us? You don't trust us. Hartmann replied without slowing. Trust has nothing to do with it. You're soldiers, that's enough. The private swallowed hard. They said the army wouldn't come. Hartmann didn't answer. The extraction took 20 minutes that felt like hours. By the time the final group reached the tree line, Soviet fire began shifting, testing, probing, but not pursuing. The rescue detachment moved quickly, carrying the wounded toward the forest's cover. Back at camp, Colonel Breuer waited with Adler and Richter standing behind him. Breuer stepped forward. Report. Hartmann replied simply. We brought out 39 survivors, 20 wounded, heavy casualties. Richter's face tightened. You interfered with a sanctioned operation. Weiss stepped forward. We stopped a massacre. Richter didn't respond. He only watched Adler, who opened a new folder and read a fresh communication from Berlin. Adler said quietly, The High Command acknowledges the losses. They also note the Army's unofficial intervention. Breuer's expression didn't change. Their operation would have collapsed entirely without intervention. Adler closed the folder. Berlin has decided to not pursue disciplinary action. Richter looked stunned. Not pursue? Adler continued. However, Berlin expects complete coordination moving forward. No independent actions, no conflicting directives, no more internal disputes. Hartmann asked, Does that apply to both sides? Adler met his eyes. It applies to whoever survives the winter. Brewer exhaled. So that's their solution. Ignore the cause, silence the argument. Adler replied, Silence is unity, Colonel. Hartmann stepped closer. Unity built on fear isn't unity. Adler didn't answer. Richter finally spoke, voice low. The SS will remember this, Major. Hartmann nodded once. So will the Army. The wind picked up outside, carrying the distant echo of artillery. The war beyond the front continued, unchanged. But inside Hitler's Reich, something had shifted, subtly, quietly, permanently. Soldiers returned to their positions. Officers resumed their duties. Reports were written, folded, and sent to Berlin. And the hidden civil war, SS versus Wehrmacht, did not end. It simply went silent long enough for the next battle to begin.